Hello everybody, and welcome. I'm very happy to be here. Fascinating idea of bringing together composers and performers of early music. On we go. So this is our first case study. It's the beginning of the first act of Orfeo. That's the original print. The English translation, modern edition, and a nice suggestive picture. So you also have the PDF with the modern edition, nice and large to see. We could spend easily the whole of this seminar just on this speech, but I just want to point out some of the main features. So early music people, you're probably quite familiar with this style of writing. We've just got a bass line. It's for any number of continuo instruments. The most likely combination in this period, it's not a harpsichord and a cello. Rather, it's going to be a sustaining instrument and a plucked instrument, and the classic combination is organ for the sustain and theorbo, the large lute, for the articulation, for the rhythmic definition. There isn't a melodic bass instrument like a cello, because as you can see from the bass line, it's not a melody. The bass line is defining the harmonies using the rules of the recently developed continuo notation. And actually one of the best continuo treatises is from the same year, 1607, as the performance of Orfeo. That treatise is Agazzari's Sopra il Basso, how to play on a bass line. So when we see a single note here in the bass, you should imagine an organ sustaining a D minor harmony and a theorbo playing an arpeggio and repeating that arpeggio in the middle of the bar where the note is tied over. And the notation strongly suggests that the theorbo would repeat certain notes more often in bar 2. So that's the accompaniment, and then we have a tenor who delivers these words, and we've got a notation of pitches and rhythm. Because we've tended to come to Monteverdi's recitative, so-called, by way of Handel and Bach and Vivaldi, and even that by way of Mendelssohn's recitative and how we were doing all this recitative in the 20th century, sometimes we think when we first look at this that this is some kind of sketch notation, that this is unfinished, that the singers have to add stuff and we don't have to take too seriously what is written here. There's actually no historical evidence to support that, and a lot of historical evidence to the contrary, that this is a very precise and highly detailed notation, but that works within the conventions, within the context of its own period. So the first thing about reading this music is how they were thinking about rhythms, where we might approach some of these complicated rhythms by counting perhaps the eighth notes when it's complicated, and certainly mostly counting quarter notes. They were counting in half notes, and they allowed quite a bit of freedom inside that regular half note beat. The particular direction of that freedom, we'll see later, is that they liked to exaggerate. They thought it was more graceful, more delightful for the ear, and also more emotional if you exaggerated the contrasts. So with those rhythms, well, what we see is that the basic rhythms really fit the language beautifully. In questo lieto e fortunato giorno. So the long notes are on the long syllables of the poetry. They called the syllables in poetry long and short. In music they called them either long and short or good and bad syllables. The word accent has another technical meaning in this period. So good and bad syllables. In questo lieto e fortunato giorno. Music is based on text. Singers are taught rhetoric. They're taught how to declaim these texts. So we can be sure that this idea of good and bad, which was central to the treatises of instrumental playing, was also central to the singer's delivery. And so, in particular at the end of the phrase, Italian poetry nearly always ends up with a bad syllable. Here the last word is giorno. So this no is pronounced when you speak, short and light, giorno. So although those two notes look equal, we know they will be performed very unequally. Giorno, one good, one bad. And as we carry on, posto fino agli amorosi affanni. As we get to the amorous affanni, that's the love troubles of Orpheus, which have now been brought to an end. That emotion in the text, notice that it gets an exaggeration of the note values. We get this tied over quarter note and we get 16th notes. Quite hard to say so quickly. Posto fino agli amorosi affanni. Not the way we would speak in everyday speech. This is not everyday conversation. This is the heightened, passionate, stylized declamation of the stage in Shakespeare's time, in Monteverdi's time. As we get later into the speech and there are more passions, these contrasts of note values come even more. Word painting, so the l'alma, the spirit, già sdegnosa, formerly so cruel of beautiful Euridice. And there we go to F sharps and B naturals, the so-called hard hexachord. So F naturals and B flats, they're soft. And F sharps and B naturals are hard. So the hard emotions get the hard hexachord. So much for the note values. The other very important element is this regular beat, the tactus. In ensemble music, it will be shown by somebody beating with their hand down, up, down for one beat, up for one beat, a half note down, a half note up, about 1 second each way. And that interacts in an interesting way with the word stresses. In questo lieto e fortunato giorno. So sometimes the word stress on its long note comes together with this tactus beat, but not always. And then the last thing I'd like to draw your attention to is, if you like, the pitch contours. And remembering that this is an imitation of speech. It's not a melody. As a melody, ba 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 ba. It's not much of a melody, but as pitch contours, we see a big story there. It starts high in the voice, and it goes lower and lower, and then in bar 4, it picks up again for the words cantiam pastori. Let's sing, fellow shepherds. This is one of the shepherds singing to the other nymphs and shepherds in pastoral Arcadia. So our speaking actor, for this is what we're imitating, comes on and starts high in his voice. On this happy day, which has seen the end of the love troubles of Orpheus, let's sing. Actually, a very effective delivery, starting high to grab the audience's attention and coming down to draw them in, and then lifting up for the command, let's sing. You'll see in the last couple of lines of the music that this same material comes back again, and a lot of musicological commentators have started saying da capo aria and things like that. But this is not Monteverdi's idea to make a da capo aria. He's just noticed that the librettist has repeated the same words. And this is a rhetorical device. It's a summing up at the end of your argument. So he said, you know, in this happy day, let's sing, because all the problems with Eurydice have finished, and now they're in love. So, on this happy day, let's sing. A beautifully structured ABA rhetorical argument, which Monteverdi then matches with the music. I've already used these words recitative and aria, but they don't actually match the period separation between the imitation of speech and actual singing. So in this speech that we've just been looking at, the shepherd says at the end of the first part, and repeats in his summing up, cantiam, let's sing. And in the following number, the shepherds sing together, and what they sing is really supposed to be a song. So we do have, in these early music dramas, we have the representation on stage of speech, and we have the representation of actual singing, diegetic song, that's the technical term. But our modern categories of recitative and aria don't fit that division. So, for example, in the middle of Act 1, one of the shepherds says, but hang on, we've been singing, and Orfeo, you haven't sung anything. Why don't you sing us a love song? And so Orfeo sings a very beautiful, very modern love song. And this love song starts off in the recitative style, but it's singing. This is Orfeo singing a song on stage. So these categories are completely different. In fact, the whole terminology of recitative and aria is really problematic for this period. I've already mentioned that the word opera, they didn't use it. We should perhaps say today music drama when we're discussing Orfeo and Arianna and these other early music dramas. What they called them at the time was things like rappresentazione, a show, a representation, or favola, a story. Arianna was called tragedia, a tragedy. So, recitative, oh dear, this word causes us so many problems because we think we know what it means. And so we come to it with all the baggage of thinking we know what it means, thinking we already know how to perform it, and we scarcely read the historical treatises that tell us how they actually performed it back then. Our minds are made up, don't confuse us with the facts. You know this sarcastic idea. The facts are actually very different from the consensus early music mind of today. So, recitare, the Italian word recitare, back then and now, means to act. And we've got a lovely source, how to be the director of early opera. The director of an early opera, the general overall director, was called the chorago, a sort of artistic director you could call him. He's not the composer, he's not the poet, but he's responsible for both of those elements and for bringing everything together. So this book, Il Chorago, it's anonymous from about 1630, and it defines recitare, acting, as presenting an imitation of some kind of real-life action. The action could be of men or of divine figures like angels. And we know that recitare, to act, it's just nothing to do with our modern idea of recitative, because in this Il Chorago book, he says that there are three ways you can do this recitare. You can do recitare with music, you can do recitare, acting, with speech only. And you can do recitare, acting, in silent mime. So recitare is not our modern recitative. It's to act. And so if we use musica recitativa, or we call a certain bit of music recitativo, it's acted. It's music for acting, dramatic music, we could say. And so a lot of music is recitativo in this sense that it's for acting, even if it's not at all in what we would call the recitative style. Musica recitativa, music for acting, includes arias. So later in the opera Orfeo, the character Orfeo sings an aria. He's really happy, he's coming out of hell triumphant, he's got Euridice with him temporarily, until he turns back and looks at her. So he sings, but in this happy moment he sings a happy aria, and it's an aria, it's a song. He's singing a happy song, it's a song. And it's an aria in the early Baroque meaning. An aria is something which has some kind of repeating structure, and this is an aria on a ground bass. But actually the repeating structure could be just a few little elements. It doesn't have to be a complete ground bass. It could just be any little rhythmic or verbal repeating structure is enough to make aria. So that famous line of Shakespeare, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. In Baroque terms, that's an aria in the middle of all this recitativo. It's a repeating structure in the middle of a lot of acting. And of course, it imitates the sound of a horse. Ta-dum, 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 ta-dum. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. The idea of time. So misura, the measure, which is written into the music, the battuta, not the bar, but the beat, the beating of time. This tactus, the way they did beat time, down and up, it's about 1 second each way. They use the word tempo in Italian, and they just meant time. This misura is not some mysterious thing, it is time itself. Just time. Real world time. We'll come to that in a moment. Structures in the poetry, whether it's light or serious, whether it's happy or sad, whether it's speech or song, according to the poetry, but also poetical, technical elements, the line length, the rhymes, internal rhythms and rhymes, the structure of stanzas. All these things are repeated in the music, in the structures of the music. These are elements of aria which structure the music. And alongside what we would nowadays call the development of opera, the new ideas in music drama, there were new fashions in courtly song. So instead of singing songs with a whole ensemble, there was a fashion for solo singing to the lute or theorbo, the picture bottom right. And those courtly songs took some of the musical styles from the drama into the court performances. So song itself starts being an imitation of theatrical acted music, which is an imitation of speech. All these things start to go into a very creative, positive spiral. What that means in particular is that in courtly song as well, they moved away from these virtuoso ornaments of the passaggi, and they were more interested in effetti, in emotional effects, and even in dramatizing a court performance. So instead of getting up and singing your song, you made an entrance in character, and you might be a nymph singing a lament with 3 narrators behind you, narrating and commenting on the story. That's Monteverdi's Lamento della Ninfa. You might be a woman in love receiving a love letter from the beloved. That's the lettera amorosa. So dramatized performances in the courtly context. So all these things are sort of cross-influencing each other. So Caccini's Le Nuove Musiche, a really important source for this new style of courtly solo singing. Music is text and rhythm and sound last of all, and not the other way round. So we already knew about the importance of text, that music is a rhetorical art, but Caccini tells us something else, that especially in this dramatic style, especially in these solo songs, it's text and rhythm that are the priorities. Text, good and bad syllables. The sound of the Italian language makes a musical phrase either legato or staccato. And when you pronounce those words in Italian, of course, legato with its single consonant sounds legato, and staccato and caccidi sound staccato. So the sound of the language creates the sound of the music. Sense groups also create the sense of the music. And if you look at the a bit of original print, beginning with Platone, Plato and the other philosophers, look at how many commas there are. Very short phrases, broken up. The way you speak formally in a big hall. Rhetorical speech. This is the sound of speech. This is the sound of music. Short phrases broken up. Meaning and emotion, just like the words legato and staccato sound like what they mean, then all the words the composer sets and that the singer sings have to sound like what they mean. Rhythm, we've mentioned this Tactus about with 1 second. I wanted to mention this period meaning of accento. It's a particular ornament which, according to Zacconi, means that the singer actually delays compared to what's written. He delays against the Tactus. The Tactus carries on. It's like Ella Fitzgerald. She's not singing unrhythmically, but she might be syncopating against a beat that she feels and understands. And the job of the rhythm section, continuo in Baroque, is not to follow that jazz singer, but to maintain the groove underneath. There are so many sources that emphasize that the audience must understand the text. This is a little different, singers. This is a little different from the idea of diction, where the idea is that the singer should pronounce, sometimes exaggeratedly. And if you pronounce too much, it becomes nonsense. And also, your pronouncing becomes the performance, and nobody really gets what you're saying. They don't get who you are. They don't get your character because there's so much diction. So diction is not quite the same thing. Diction is what the singer does. But what we want is that the audience understands. So I'll give you a quick example in my native language, in English. You probably know that culinary masterpiece of Great Britain, fish and chips. And native speakers never say and can hardly understand fish and chips, because we say fish and chips. Fission, like nuclear fission. Fish and chips. Fish and chips. And when I say fish and chips, everybody understands me better, and they also get the emotion of fish and chips. They get the flavour of the salt and vinegar. By the way, we always say salt and vinegar and not salt and vinegar. So communication and the emotional communication are slightly different from perfect diction. So for composers too, we have to write in a way that the audience will understand the text, in this context at least. And remembering our aims of rhetoric, Explaining, well, we just want the audience to get the text. We have to tell the story. So explain, teach, tell the story, whatever. Get the words across. They have to understand the text. We have to charm the audience. Text helps with that too, especially if it's a good text. And to move the passions, the audience have to get the text. All of these things depends on communicating the text. So singers and composers have a job to do here, but the test is what the audience actually get. And I love this quote from Galliano about his opera Daphne, a year after Orfeo, same year as Arianna. Be persuaded that true delight for the audience arises from the understanding of the words. So since our Tactus beat is about 1 second, no digital clocks back then, 1 second as best you can imagine it, remember it, reproduce it. Since our Tactus beat is 1 second, and since the continuo, as you'll see in the example on the right, they're only playing one harmony every 2 seconds, all this complicated stuff, which the singer has a certain amount of freedom with, essentially this is time code. This is time durations. The singers should sing these note values, with some exaggeration please, in the 2 seconds allotted. And in that sense we come quite close to quite different styles of modern notation.